There's not 5 styles in this class. There's just one approach. So when I do this one, I'm going to show you how I think about each of the stages. Everything kind of leads to the next. So my first step with this guy would be to do gesture. So gesture is just about laying something in, keeping it loose in a way that's thematic to the way the muscles are working. A lot of people that put up what I expect, they have none of this kind of sense of motion. Contour drawings are always really like flat or stiff looking because there's no sense of what's actually happening in the muscles. So this is just your lay-in. It's not one separate style from all the others. And so here's our arms. And then when I'm done with this, I move on to the next step. So because the weight was pushed over here, that shifts this side of the pelvis up. So now I'm just on this step. This rib cage leans back a little bit, then the shoulders lean even more. So those are tilts, right? Tilt is a way that on top of my gesture, I can make clear assessments about 2D relationships of balance, how things lean. After that, and usually because I think people struggle with clear shapes and ellipses, I use the tilt as a way to help organize my shape. So with shapes, I'm just putting in the rib cage and pelvis. Pelvis should be, way for you to double check early on, 1 head tall by 2 wide. So 1 by 2. So when you put that in, I use my tilt as a way to decide on that width. And then I also use the tilt as the major axis. And so I try to draw that ellipse symmetrically to it. And that becomes an early stand-in for my pelvis. The rib cage is 2 heads wide, so it's the exact same as the pelvis. So this one, except it's closer to 2 heads tall. It's more like 1 2/3 head tall, but if you want to keep it at 2, that's fine. So I'm gonna start it there. There's about 1/3 of a head between rib cage and pelvis. And then I see the rib cage as nearing vertical. I know it looks like there's more of a curve that way, but that's because of the shoulders. The reason I break these up is because I always see people drawing different proportions for their rib cage and pelvis. Like I'm mostly used to seeing students or just people that draw figures making these 2 different widths. That's totally not the case at all. So for anatomy, I think it could be really confusing and destructive for later stages if that's how you're working. That's done. So now I move on, and I'm not shifting in between styles or types of drawing. It's all part of the same. So let's turn that down and then just add the next step. So contour drawings, usually, I find there's a lot of symmetry here. Like these end up just looking exactly the same. And we want to start to think of them with more dynamic issues or qualities with CNS because these are areas of muscle. And so they're always stretching or pinching. So the skull, the back of the cranial ridge is farther from the rib cage. So that means these 2 areas are stretching. And in this stage, we focused on overlaps and wrapping lines as a way to continue to build form. So that's an S curve. That's because that means a passive muscle or a passive area. It's relaxing. I'm tying it to the rib cage, bringing it inside because unlike contour, I never isolate lines to the outside. And then this side is much more clearly pinching. So here's a C curve. Around, and now we've locked our head into the neck, and that has a nice relationship into the rib cage. This side is also stretching because the rib cage and pelvis have moved farther apart. So S curve, right? And my S curves aren't like super literal. They can be kind of weak and bold. And then wrapping line. Line always has to end inside. That comes in, rest in the area of the pubic bone. And then on this side, because the rib cage moved closer to the pelvis, this is now pinching. So I'm gonna add a C curve here. So that shows muscle either contracting to pull these 2 things closer or fat and muscle pinching because those 2 bones are coming closer proximity. That's done. It's not a different style. It's just a different stage in the whole of the buildup. But once I'm done, then I can cross it off. And the goal, I think, for this class is that you do this enough where the steps become second nature. You don't have to separate them because you can just understand what's happening. And then you can start to edit some out. Like I don't go through all the steps anymore because I know where everything is and how it's working. So I could kind of collapse maybe 3 or 4 steps into one. Now I'm just looking at landmarks. So what are the bones doing? How are they moving to support the pose? So here's the pit of the neck. We just start with the rib cage. The sternum is about a head tall. That's closer to the left side than the right. So that helps me to understand the turn or rotation of the pelvis. This is a male rib cage. And so this opening gets broader then. So I'm going to pull this open a bit more. That has to do with the size of muscles on the back and how it can spread or open this. And so here I tried to make my shape with the landmarks in terms of how I understood what my reference is. Face the left, so I can follow that down to the belly button there. And then I also see the pelvis in 3/4 because of where that symmetry line is. So that, I'm going to look for my anterior superior iliac spine. See it here, and I also see it here. This is what that area of fat and muscle are seated on. This is the pubic bone. Let's do our arms. So the clavicle aren't too changed. Maybe this is a little bit higher. So it'll be up there. This one over here. These are really going to start to change when the arm goes above the horizon line or the shoulder. We're not there yet. So there's not too much of a shift. This would be the scapula from the back. We could see through X-ray vision. And then for the arms, I'm just going to make some straight lines. This is the elbow. The elbow always lines up with the bottom of the rib cage. So I'm trying to make kind of these smaller proportional assessments here. We're going to leave the head out for now, so you don't have to worry about doing anything with head. So you can put in your halves and thirds if you want. So this would be part of that stage if we were there. Back of the cranium, temporal mandibular joint. And for our arms, this arm is supinated. Thumb points away. So thumbs out here, palm is facing out. You get stuck, the wrist should line up with the beginning of the femur. This side, it's also supinated, but let's draw it pronated. So I always make a little triangle for the funny bone. So you guys see that here. That's what I'm looking to line up with the bottom of the rib cage. Pronated, if we turn the thumb to point in, I would draw or represent not as just a rectangle, but one with a diagonal through it to show that the radius is crossed over. So this would be the top of the palm. This would be the thumb here, fingers. That'd be the only real difference at this stage. For the legs, so you can see that there's a bump here or a bump here on the contour. That's your great trochanter. It's the beginning of the femur. So if you can find your pelvis, go down 2/3 of the way and build a little doorknob shape. So what you want to show is that your femur projects off of the side of the pelvis. The femur angles in towards the midline. There's the this is the patella. From there we have a tibia, be straight, fibula, which is closer to the back, and then they end in a asymmetrical organization. The inside of your ankle is higher than the outside, and then the foot kind of turned out this side. So I don't really see it except in slight profile, so it'd be back there, the beginning of the femur. Then same thing, set up your straights. I always look to relate the knees because they should line up. If it's standing, it's the weight-bearing one. Ankle, and I don't really see too much of the foot, so it'd be like right back here. That's done. So I can cross this off. They don't have anything else in terms of landmarks to be concerned with or to find. I'm not going to draw every single rib. I think that'd be a waste of time. So that would just bring us to our very last stage, and that's just focused on seeing perspective. So we can turn that down. Again, the last stage wasn't a different style. It's not a different approach, all the same approach. And finding those landmarks helps me see perspectives. Again, for the rib cage, all you have to do, and for the pelvis, let's say our landmarks, we found them. If you can just connect dots, you can find perspectives. So across is width. You bring that 10th rib to the pit of the neck. That's the height. So you can frame out any shape with those points. So if we do that here, here's a width, here's a height. I'm just going to bring that in and do it for the rest. So do that here, here. The only thing that we're missing is a depth. And you could see in him, like there's a light side, and then all of a sudden it turns into halftone or shadow. That's what I'm looking to get in my drawings here, where we can't put muscles on anything that we don't see as turning, because there's a different muscle that goes here than in here. There aren't muscles that confuse planes and just kind of sit broadly across them. They're pretty specific. So for whatever you have left of your egg, I just drop a depth line here. And it's not going to match the width of the figure because we haven't built out muscles yet. So this should be hopefully a little bit inside of what you expect the contour to be. And I just added the depth there. I don't want or care to add anything additional. So this is good. Let's color those planes in so you can see the difference in terms of perspective. Then I'm looking for pelvis. We could do the same thing. If I have my basic shape, which we worked hard to find in steps 2, and then as is always beneath the 10th rib. So if you get lost, you can kind of use this. Between those, I get a width. Should be the same as that front plane. And if you find that down to the bottom of the pubic bone, that's your height. So this is a front plane. So if I graph that over here, connect my as is, so I maintain the tilt height. So rib cage and pelvis, I always try to make them different. Rib cage from the front, at least you would see under. Pelvis from the front, you would see over. And that's because they don't lead in the same way in our bodies. Respectively, they're at different angles. Here's another height, width. Remember, you want all these to be parallel. Any lines that are the same, like your height lines, all need to be parallel. Your width lines all have to be parallel. Depth. What you don't want to do is start out, here's my front, and then do a depth. Right? That's going to look like it's distorted. So I just make them all the same, all going the same direction. And now we have something that we can actually discuss anatomy relative to. I can talk about the gluteus medius and tensor fascia on the side, rectus abdominis on the front of the box, the internal oblique versus the external oblique, right? Because each muscle belongs in your body, rests on a different plane. For the arms and legs, that was not as formulaic in terms of adding up boxes, but more about trying to see slender cylinders that might be a little bit larger than the bone. So what I would always do with these cylinders is make sure they have some attachment to the last perspective. So like don't do a box and then a cylinder all the way down here, because that's a lot to make up with muscle. I always overlap like a little bit, make them touch. So this leg comes forward. So I use the bone as a way to kind of get the tilt. I parallel it with the lines, and then I show the perspective. And with the legs kind of all placed in with cylinders, like it's easy for me to diagnose a drawing with these steps in mind, because each one is a different competency. Like usually people that have proportion errors get these wrong early on, or people that have a lot of stiff qualities to their pose don't put in connections. People that suffer with perspective struggle with landmarks and how they're placing, right? So that's the reason. Arms, this one comes out. So I always first decide on forward back. That's not coming out that much. It's just kind of profile. This is the direction and the size. And so I'm just gonna add a little tiny ellipse here. For the sake of argument, even though it's not what the pose is doing, let's have this one go the opposite way. So if something goes away, I'll see the top of that ellipse as the leading element, unlike if something comes forward. So that would be a big difference. This is away, the other is towards. Let's have this one come back out. We'll just reverse it if I want something to come forward. And I use those bones as a way to help develop the cylinder. Gives me like a structure underneath to use. And then you're done. And now we're ready to do anatomy.
Michael, check out his Introduction to Figure Construction and Head Construction courses on Proko.com. Both courses have hours of demonstrations, lectures, and student critiques. If you're interested, click on the links in the description. Thanks.